What's the most ridiculous rule you've encountered in your HOA agreement? Story 1. So, my HOA is super strict about everything, but the one rule that still makes me shake my head is the no window coverings rule. Yep, you read that right. According to the HOA, you are not allowed to have any curtains or blinds that can be seen from the outside of your home. But here's the catch. The rule only applies to the windows on the front of your house, meaning you're totally free to have all the weird, gaudy blinds you want on the back and sides. So, imagine being stuck with bare windows, knowing everyone driving by can see your entire living room, kitchen, whatever. I tried to explain to them that sometimes privacy is a little more important than how aesthetically pleasing our windows are, but they weren't having it. They even sent me a warning notice when I put up some simple sheer curtains that were totally neutral in color. They said it didn't match the community aesthetic. Honestly, I'm about to throw a party with a "come see my bare windows" theme just to prove a point. Story 2. A few years ago, I moved into a townhouse with a lovely backyard. Everything was great until I found out about the HOA's gardening. Now, I've always loved gardening, but apparently, my love for plants does not align with the HOA's idea of what's acceptable. They have this strange rule that any plant you grow must be non-invasive, which is fine, but they took it to the next level. They actually gave me a list of approved plants that I could grow, and it included things like non-flowering bushes and grass. No roses, no sunflowers, no tomato plants, nothing fun or colorful. When I asked about the why, the response was that these plants were too much of a distraction and might ruin the uniformity of the neighborhood. Honestly, they were more concerned about a few stray rose petals than people's enjoyment of their space. Eventually, I just put up some fake flowers and called it a day. It's still a joke among my neighbors. If you want any color or life, just slap a plastic flower in the yard. Story 3. You know what's ridiculous? My HOA doesn't allow any sports equipment to be left out in your yard or driveway. So, picture this. Kids can't even leave their bikes or skateboards in front of their house. I'm talking about an empty driveway. No toys, no bikes, no basketball hoop, nothing. If your kids leave anything out, even for an hour, the HOA will send you a letter with a fine. Apparently, the reasoning is that it distracts from the community's appearance and makes the neighborhood look disorganized. As a parent, I honestly don't know what to do with this. If my kids have a few friends over and want to shoot some hoops, I'm expected to make them pick everything up and cart it inside every single time? It's absurd. Last summer, my neighbor got a $75 fine for a soccer ball that was accidentally left out for a day. People started calling the HOA the fun police because of how extreme the enforcement was. To top it off, they never addressed the fact that the lawns all look the same. No personal expression allowed, but don't you dare have a basketball hoop visible. Story 4. The most ridiculous HOA rule I've encountered is the no drying clothes outside. What? Apparently, using a clothesline is considered a violation of the HOA's aesthetic standards. It's deemed an eyesore, and they sent me a notice after I used a clothesline for a week last summer. Their reasoning? They claim that drying clothes outside detracts from the visual appeal of the neighborhood and could lower property values. They even told me I could be fined if I didn't remove it. I never thought anyone would care about the way my damp towels look hanging in my own yard. The HOA even suggested using a dryer instead. But I live in an area where energy consumption is a concern. I thought it would be better to save on electricity, but apparently my HOA would prefer I waste power than air dry my laundry. Needless to say, I now dry my clothes in secret, just hoping they don't get ratted out by my nosy neighbors. Story 5. This one is just wild. My HOA decided that all cars parked in driveways must be parked with the front bumper facing the street. Apparently, they believe it improves the flow and visual harmony of the neighborhood. If you park with your rear bumper facing the street, it's considered a violation. I don't even know how they can enforce that because, let's face it, it's completely ridiculous. You should be able to park however you want on your own property, but nope, not here. If you forget to park with the front facing out, the HOA will send you a warning. I got one of these notices after I pulled into my driveway late at night. And of course, I parked the wrong way. I honestly didn't even think it was a thing. And they claimed it was because I violated the aesthetic standards of the community. I don't even know how anyone looks at their own driveway in a way that they can detect this stuff. So now, every time I park, I double-check to make sure my car is facing the correct direction, like I'm living in some twisted car show. Story 6. My HOA has this rule that every tree in your yard must be professionally trimmed twice a year. But it's not as simple as just hiring someone. The HOA provides a list of approved tree trimming services, and if you don't use one of their companies, you're subject to a fine. The catch? The companies on the list charge an arm and a leg. The trimming job is ridiculously expensive for something that would typically cost half as much. But here's where it gets really out of hand. If you don't get it done, you get a warning. And if you ignore that, they'll send you another notice with an even bigger fine. I tried to trim my own trees once to save some money, and the HOA sent a team of inspectors to my house just to check the work. They said it didn't meet their community guidelines, so I was forced to hire someone off their list for the next round. This whole thing feels like a racket, and honestly, it's beyond frustrating. Every year, I just brace myself for the inevitable trimming season, which I'm convinced is just a way for them to make extra money. Story 7. Okay, so this one's not exactly a rule, but it's close enough to be ridiculous. My HOA has a community aesthetic guideline that says all fences must be earth-toned, but they never define what that actually means. So, naturally, when my neighbors decided to put up a new fence, they chose a deep forest green. It looked great, it matched the landscaping perfectly, and there was no way it clashed with the rest of the neighborhood. But the HOA came knocking, claiming that green was too bold and that it disrupted the harmony of the community. They insisted on beige or brown, so my neighbors had to replace their perfectly fine green fence with a boring brown one, even though the green fit the environment way better. There was no end to the back and forth with the HOA. Nothing seemed to satisfy them. We joked that next, they'd probably demand that we paint our trees beige just to keep up the earth tone vibe. Honestly, it's embarrassing how little they care about personal choice, and the whole thing feels like a scheme to force conformity, no matter how much sense the original color made. Story 8. I've lived in my HOA-governed neighborhood for about 10 years now, and the most ridiculous rule they've ever enforced is the approved flag policy. You're allowed to fly a flag, but only if it's one of their approved flags. I kid you not. There's a list, yes, an actual list, of flags you can legally fly in your yard. The American flag? Of course that's allowed. But get this. If you want to show your support for a local sports team, or, say, display a pride flag, you have to submit an official request to the HOA. They claim it's because those flags can distract from the neighborhood's uniform appearance. But the funniest part, one of the flags on their list is for a local gardening club. That's right, a gardening club flag gets priority over any personal expression. When I asked why certain flags were approved and others weren't, they just referred back to the community spirit angle. But it seemed pretty clear to me that they were just trying to control what people could and couldn't show off in their own yards. My neighbors and I all chuckled when the HOA had to issue a formal apology to the person who had been flying a Save the Bees flag, saying it violated the policy, even though it was totally relevant. Story 9. There's a rule in my HOA that prohibits anyone from putting up a birdbath in their front yard. Yeah, you read that right, a birdbath. The HOA claims that bird baths attract too many pests and can be unsightly, which is hilarious because my yard is filled with beautiful flowers, and no one complains about the bees and butterflies. I just don't understand how a small decorative bird bath could possibly disrupt the community's vibe. It's not like I was setting up a giant inflatable flamingo in the yard. I tried to argue that bird baths actually benefit the local wildlife and attract birds, which most people love, but the HOA wasn't hearing it. They said it could cause excessive moisture buildup, and that could lead to unsanitary conditions. At this point, I've given up. My bird bath is tucked discreetly behind the bushes, and I've stopped talking about it with anyone who lives here because it feels like I'm part of a weird underground club just to have a simple feature in my own yard. Honestly, it's so out of touch with reality. Story 10. The rule that drives me nuts is the one about mailbox height. Apparently, your mailbox has to be exactly 42 inches from the ground, and it must never deviate from that measurement. The HOA actually has a person who drives around with a tape measure to ensure everyone's mailboxes are compliant. So, one day, I get a notice saying that my mailbox was an inch too high, and I needed to lower it, or I'd face a fine. I thought it was a joke, but no, they were serious. After some back and forth with the HOA, they sent a maintenance team to my house to lower the mailbox for me. I couldn't believe it. Someone actually came to move my mailbox a single inch. The worst part is that this rule is apparently in place to maintain the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood, which, in my mind, is just an excuse for control. I had no idea that a mailbox could be so crucial to the overall look of a community. Now, I spend extra time each year making sure my mailbox hasn't magically grown a millimeter, because if it has, I know I'll get a letter from the HOA demanding immediate action. Story 11. So, my HOA has a rule that any modification to your property must be approved before it's done. I know, that's pretty standard, right? But the ridiculous part is that they require approval for things you would never expect, like putting up a doormat. Yes, you heard me right. I once put a doormat outside my door that simply said, "Welcome," and I got a notice the next day stating that the font was too bold and didn't meet their community-friendly standards. I called the HOA office to ask why this was even a rule, and the lady on the phone said it was because the doormat could impact the overall aesthetic of the neighborhood. She even suggested I get one with a more neutral design, like plain beige or gray. I couldn't believe it. It's a doormat. I had to send them a photo of the new doormat I picked out, plain, mind you, and they reluctantly approved it. That whole experience left me wondering how far they'll go. Will they start asking for approval if I paint my front door? Should I start sending them my shopping list for anything I buy to make sure it's HOA approved? I'll admit, it makes me nervous now to even hang up a seasonal wreath without wondering if I'll get a notice. Story 12. Our HOA has this bizarre rule that pets are only allowed to be walked in certain areas of the neighborhood, specifically designated pet zones. I can't even begin to explain how absurd this is. Essentially, they've marked off specific parts of the neighborhood where you can walk your dog, but if you walk outside of those areas, you're officially breaking HOA regulations. The idea is to preserve the cleanliness and harmony of the community, but here's the kicker. The designated pet zones are usually on busy roads where it's dangerous to walk your dog. I had a friendly conversation with one of the HOA board members about this, and she just shrugged it off, saying it was for the greater good. Now, instead of walking my dog around the peaceful, quiet streets where we used to go, I have to take him on routes that are crowded, noisy, and stressful for both of us. I actually witnessed a neighbor get a fine for walking their dog off the path near their own home. It was crazy. It's as if the HOA has completely ignored the fact that dogs need space and a bit of freedom to roam. It feels like they're more focused on controlling every aspect of life rather than actually considering what's best for the people and pets living in the community. Story 13. One of the most insane rules I encountered in my HOA was the prohibition of any outdoor lighting, even holiday lights. I had no idea this was a thing when I moved in, but when the holiday season rolled around, I decorated my house with some simple string lights on the front porch. They were tasteful. Nothing too extravagant, just a little holiday cheer, you know? I figured that would be fine, especially since several neighbors did the same. To my surprise, I got a letter from the HOA saying that exterior lighting was prohibited because it disrupts the community's nighttime tranquility. Apparently, the HOA was worried that lights would be too distracting for neighbors in the evening. I could not believe it. The letter also included a warning that if I didn't take the lights down within 7 days, I'd face a fine. Now, I'm no Grinch, but this just seemed petty and controlling. Some of the older neighbors actually sided with me, saying the rule was overly harsh, but they had to follow it too. I thought maybe I could sneak the lights back up when no one was looking, but then I realized this was probably a part of the HOA's weird power trip. So, no more lights for me, just the humdrum dark porch for the holidays. It's such a buzzkill. Story 14. The strangest and most frustrating rule in my HOA involves the acceptable door hardware policy. Apparently, every house has to have the exact same type of door handle, lock, and knocker on the front door. The exact same. I can't even choose a simple new handle or lock that I like without getting the HOA's approval. And if it's not from the approved vendors, they won't allow it. My front door was perfectly fine, but I wanted to update the handle to something a little more modern with a sleek design. I figured that was an easy fix, but I received a letter saying that I needed to revert it to the standard issue handle, which was this old, clunky design that the HOA has insisted on for years. They said the changes would disrupt the uniformity of the community. I wasn't even trying to make a dramatic change, just a small, practical upgrade. When I argued that my choice was still in line with the overall style of the house, they simply told me that it didn't matter. The design had to match the established aesthetic set by the original builder. This rule also applies to door knockers, so if you wanted to replace one with a custom design, forget it. It's honestly exhausting to deal with this type of micromanaging, especially when it's such a trivial thing. I've now stopped asking about making any changes to my house because I know it'll turn into a huge ordeal. Story 15. I've had my fair share of frustrating HOA experiences, but the one that really blew my mind was the outdoor furniture regulation. In my neighborhood, you're allowed to have outdoor furniture, but the type of furniture is strictly controlled. The HOA insists that all outdoor seating must be classic in style and in line with neighborhood standards, which they didn't actually define, by the way. So, when I purchased a cute modern metal lounge set for my backyard, I was blindsided by an email from the HOA telling me that the furniture was not in compliance. Apparently, it was too contemporary and didn't match the neighborhood's rustic charm. It was literally just a few sleek chairs and a table, nothing that was too out of place in a well-maintained backyard. The furniture was neutral in color, black metal with a light gray cushion, But the HOA wanted me to swap it out for something more traditional, like wicker or wood. They even suggested I go for earth-toned cushions, because they apparently believed my black and gray setup was too modern. I was stunned. It's a backyard. Who cares if the furniture is contemporary? The worst part is that I started looking at my neighbor's outdoor furniture, and it's all the same. The exact same neutral wicker sets and beige cushions. It felt like they wanted us all to live in this weird 1950s sitcom version of suburbia. I ended up returning the modern set and getting something in line with their approved aesthetic, but it felt like giving in to a weird, arbitrary rule just to avoid fines. Story 16. I've lived in my HOA-controlled neighborhood for a few years now, and the most absurd rule they have is the one about vehicle color. That's right. The HOA actually has a regulation about what color cars are allowed to park in front of your house. They insist that no car can be a bright, vibrant color, claiming it disrupts the overall aesthetic of the street. This includes cars that are bright red, neon green, or electric blue. One of my neighbors, who drives a bright yellow sports car, was fined $100 because of this rule. They said her car was too eye-catching and that it clashed with the subtle tones of the community. It was honestly ridiculous because the rest of the neighborhood is full of various shades of gray, beige, and white cars. So it's like they just wanted to make sure everything blended together like a bland color palette. When I asked about this in the HOA meeting, one board member actually said that too much color causes chaos, as if a yellow car could bring down the entire neighborhood's property value. I seriously cannot imagine how anyone could think that a car's color would affect their quality of life in such a profound way. I've been quietly avoiding buying any fun-colored cars for fear that I'll be next in line for a fine. Story 17. There's this one rule in my HOA that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. No outdoor umbrellas allowed. At first, I thought it was a joke. I mean, who gets upset over a simple umbrella? Apparently, the HOA. They claim that umbrellas clash with the natural aesthetic of the neighborhood and create unnecessary visual clutter. This rule came to light when I put up a red umbrella in my backyard to provide some shade during the summer months. The next week, I received a letter from the HOA stating that the umbrella was in violation of community guidelines. They said that I needed to take it down or face a fine. I called them up, trying to reason with them that it was just a regular outdoor umbrella, nothing flashy, and it wasn't even visible from the street. But they insisted that all outdoor furniture had to adhere to their uniform earth tone scheme. The funny part? I later found out that one of my neighbors had a massive outdoor gazebo with colorful furniture, but it was grandfathered in, because it had been there before the rule was enforced. Apparently, the HOA sees no problem with that, but a humble umbrella in my yard is a bridge too far. So now I sit in the sun, sweating, because umbrellas are apparently too disruptive. It's a real shame that the HOA's idea of harmony involves stripping away any personal style or practicality. Story 18. My HOA has an extremely weird rule when it comes to growing grass. You're not allowed to grow any grass in your front yard unless it's a specific variety that has been pre-approved. The HOA's reasoning is that the approved variety is the only one that's consistent with the community's aesthetic. So the grass you see on most lawns is a mix of two things: plain green grass and a weird yellowish variety that's supposed to match the earth tones of the neighborhood. I planted a nice lush patch of green grass in my front yard, and it was thriving, until I received a notice from the HOA saying that my grass didn't match the community-approved variety, and that I had to replace it with their prescribed type. I thought I was being pranked, but no, the HOA was dead serious. They even provided me with a list of suppliers where I could purchase their approved grass seeds, all of which cost far more than regular grass. When I asked for a reasonable explanation, the HOA told me that it was to ensure uniformity and to maintain visual continuity throughout the neighborhood. But here's the kicker. None of the other houses with the approved grass look any better than mine did with the vibrant, healthy grass I had. It all just seemed like a way to force people into spending more money on something that made no practical sense. Eventually, I gave in and replaced my grass, but it still baffles me that the HOA was willing to enforce something so petty. Story 19. If you ever think your HOA is bad, let me tell you about my neighborhood's rule about satellite dishes. I had to get rid of my satellite dish last year because the HOA said it was not in compliance with their regulations. Apparently, there's a no visible satellite dishes policy, which sounds fine until you realize they expect you to somehow hide it, even though it's completely necessary for some people to access television. The worst part? The HOA requires that all satellite dishes be installed on the backside of your home. If they can even be seen from the front, you get a fine. When I questioned this, they said it was because satellite dishes disrupt the visual flow of the neighborhood. How does a tiny satellite dish disrupt a neighborhood's aesthetic? We're not in some upscale, gated community where every inch of space must look pristine. I had to go through the whole process of hiring a specialist to move my dish to a back area that barely got a signal, which resulted in a more expensive service plan just to be compliant with the HOA rules. This whole ordeal made me realize how absurd the HOA is when it comes to controlling even the smallest details of your home. Now, I have a bigger, uglier antenna on the back of my house that works even less efficiently than my previous dish. The HOA's idea of maintaining visual continuity is honestly baffling at best. Story 20. In my HOA, holiday decorations are a huge issue, but the rule that takes the cake is their no inflatables policy. Apparently, any inflatable decorations, whether it's for Halloween, Christmas, or even Easter, are considered unsightly and inconsistent with the neighborhood's decor. The HOA claims that inflatables are too tacky and that they distract from the elegance they are trying to maintain in the area. So when I put up a simple inflatable Santa and reindeer display for Christmas last year, I thought it would be a fun, festive touch to the neighborhood. But I received a letter within days saying I had violated the HOA's guidelines, and I was instructed to take it down immediately or face a fine. After arguing with them, they said I could put up approved, non-inflatable decorations, but no inflatable objects were allowed on anyone's property. I even tried explaining that inflatables are a beloved tradition for many families, and that I didn't see how a Santa Claus on my lawn could hurt anyone. But it didn't make a difference. As if this wasn't frustrating enough, several neighbors who had hung wreaths or set up traditional decorations like little light-up trees or plastic nativity scenes weren't given any complaints. Apparently, those didn't fall under the tacky category. I eventually gave in and took the inflatable down. But now every year I find myself debating whether it's worth the hassle to put up anything fun at all. I sometimes wonder if the HOA just wants the neighborhood to look like a perfectly sterile, holiday-free zone, which is totally the opposite of what I expect from a place that should be about community. Story 21. I've always enjoyed planting my own vegetables, and a few years ago, I decided to start a small vegetable garden in my backyard. I thought it would be a good way to save money and eat healthier. Little did I know my HOA had a very strict policy about what kind of plants you can grow, and vegetables were not on their approved list. Apparently, they're concerned that vegetable gardens don't blend in with the community aesthetic. I received a letter from the HOA warning me that I needed to remove the plants or face a fine. At first, I thought it was a joke, but the more I read, the more I realized they were serious. They said that if I wanted to grow anything in my garden, it had to be non-edible and visually pleasing, which is basically their code for decorative. So I had to pull up my tomatoes, zucchini, and peppers and replace them with ornamental flowers. I was fine with that. But it really irked me that I couldn't just have a simple vegetable garden in my own yard. To make matters worse, my neighbor across the street has a massive flower garden, and no one said anything about that, even though it's just as disruptive to the aesthetic as my veggies would have been. I guess growing food is just too unattractive for them. Story 22. The most bizarre HOA rule I've come across is the one about the size of your garage door. According to the HOA, your garage door can only be a certain width, regardless of the size of your house. If you want to build a larger garage to accommodate 2 cars side by side, forget it. The HOA says that any modification to the size of your garage door that exceeds the approved dimensions will be deemed a violation of the neighborhood's spatial uniformity. I ran into this issue when I remodeled my house and added a second garage to make more space for my family's vehicles. The contractor suggested a double-wide garage door, which made perfect sense for the additional space. But when I submitted my plans to the HOA for approval, they shot it down, saying the existing door size was the only acceptable one. I was told to either shrink the garage to fit the original door or tear it down entirely. Naturally, I was furious. Why should the size of my garage door matter when it's all on my property? After a long back and forth with the board, I eventually had to go with their specifications, which meant having an incredibly awkward, narrow garage that barely fits my car. It was honestly a waste of time and money to deal with their rigid, unreasonable demands. Story 23. My HOA has this very strange rule when it comes to solar panels. They've decided that no solar panels are allowed on the front-facing side of your house, even if you want to help the environment and reduce your carbon footprint. Apparently, they say solar panels are unsightly and don't fit with the aesthetic charm of the neighborhood. This rule came to light when I installed solar panels on the back of my roof, but I also wanted to install a few on the front-facing part to get the maximum energy efficiency. I was shocked when the HOA told me that wasn't allowed, and I had to move the panels. They even suggested I should hide the ones on the back of my house with trees and shrubbery, as though that would somehow disguise them. I tried explaining that solar panels aren't exactly ugly and that the technology is becoming more accepted, but they insisted that the aesthetics of the neighborhood came first. It was especially frustrating because my solar panels didn't even obstruct any view. They were installed on the roof and weren't visible from the street. But apparently, the HOA doesn't care if something is practical or energy efficient, as long as it doesn't fit their outdated idea of how things should look. I eventually had to move everything to the back, which meant sacrificing half of the energy savings I'd been hoping. Story 24. One of the most restrictive rules in my neighborhood is the policy about seasonal decorations. Now, I get that people can go overboard with Halloween or Christmas decorations, but the HOA in my neighborhood takes things to the extreme. According to the rules, you can only display decorations for 2 weeks before and after a major holiday. If you leave your decorations out longer than that, you get a fine. When I put up my Christmas lights one year, I left them up a few days into January because I liked the holiday spirit and didn't want to rush taking them down. That's when I received a letter from the HOA demanding that I take the lights down immediately or face a fine. They even included pictures of my house, pointing out that it was unacceptable to keep decorations after the new year. I argued that I wasn't hurting anyone by keeping the lights up for a few extra days, but the HOA board stuck to their guns. I was told that I needed to follow the community guidelines to maintain order and uniformity in the neighborhood. Honestly, it made me feel like I was living in some dystopian world where every little decision had to be approved. The worst part? I'm not alone. Several of my neighbors have faced similar fines for having decorations up too long. It's not like we're talking about Christmas lights that stay up year-round. It's 2 extra weeks of festivity that make the place feel alive. It's just another example of how obsessed my HOA is with controlling every aspect of my life. Story 25. I was once told that I couldn't use a clothesline in my backyard. I live in a relatively eco-conscious neighborhood, and I thought it would be a great way to reduce my energy consumption while also avoiding those pesky dryer sheets. I set up a simple, inexpensive clothesline in the corner of my yard and started hanging my laundry to dry. A week later, I got a letter from the HOA stating that it violated their neighborhood aesthetic and that I needed to take it down immediately or face a fine. They claimed that clotheslines were unsightly and could reduce property values. I tried to reason with them, saying that clotheslines were a great sustainable practice, but they didn't want to hear it. They told me that I could use an indoor drying rack, but no outdoor drying devices were allowed. The whole thing felt incredibly backwards, especially considering the neighborhood had no problem with large, unsightly dumpsters and construction equipment left around for weeks. I eventually had to take down my clothesline, but it really made me feel like the HOA was more concerned with appearances than actually promoting environmental responsibility or sustainability. It's a frustrating reminder that sometimes we're not allowed to do things that benefit us just because they don't fit with someone else's narrow vision of how things should be. Story 26. I've lived in my HOA-governed neighborhood for a couple of years, and I've learned that there are some rules that just don't make sense. One of the strangest is the no visible trash rule. You see, the HOA claims that trash bins are a visual nuisance, and you're not allowed to leave them visible on the street or even in your driveway. They even go so far as to say you can't leave your trash bins by the curb until the night before pickup. If your bins are even an inch out of place or not properly hidden, you're subject to a fine. One time, I got a letter for leaving my trash bin slightly to the left of the driveway. It was still on my property, and the HOA said it was visible from the street and that it disrupted the clean look of the neighborhood. What's even worse is that there are a few houses on my street with gigantic decorative lawn ornaments like giant flamingos or oversized gnomes that no one bats an eye at. But my trash bin placement? That's a problem. I even tried calling the HOA to ask why things like tacky yard decorations were allowed, but a simple trash bin couldn't be. They told me that these things didn't disrupt the flow of the neighborhood. It seems like their priorities are totally off. Story 27. I can't be the only one who thinks that some HOA rules are absolutely over the top, right? The one I find the most frustrating is the no satellite dishes rule. It's not just about the size or placement of your dish. No satellite dishes are allowed, period. According to the HOA, they claim that satellite dishes distract from the aesthetic unity of the neighborhood, which is their way of saying they don't want anyone to be able to get satellite TV. This rule became a big issue for me when I moved in. I tried to install a satellite dish for TV because the cable service in the area was off, and I didn't want to rely on streaming services. But the HOA sent me a nastygram saying that any satellite installation must be removed immediately, or I'd be fined. I even asked them if I could move the dish to a back corner of my property, but they still insisted it was against the rules. I started to wonder how much of my freedom they were going to take away. If I want to get my favorite shows, I have to fork over more money for cable or hope my streaming doesn't buffer every 5 minutes. It's incredibly frustrating to realize that my choice in entertainment is restricted because of this ridiculous rule. Story 28. One of the strangest HOA rules in my neighborhood is the height restriction for fences. I get it if you want some kind of uniformity or curb appeal, but the thing is, the HOA has a very specific rule on how tall your backyard fence can be. They've decided that no fence can be more than 4 feet tall, even if you're just trying to create privacy. I live on a busy street, and my backyard faces a public park, so having a little more privacy from strangers walking by would be really nice. But nope, if I wanted to build a 6-foot fence to give myself some peace and quiet, I would be in violation of the rules. I tried to argue with the HOA, saying that it's ridiculous to have a 4-foot fence when my neighbors across the street have high, solid fences that block out all the noise. The HOA told me that taller fences create a division between neighbors as if it was a matter of community unity. The best part? A few of my neighbors actually had taller fences built before the rule was enforced, and they were somehow grandfathered in. So, my attempts to add a simple privacy fence were rejected, and I still have to live with people peeking into my yard while I'm having barbecues or relaxing outside. It's honestly a bit much. Story 29. In our neighborhood, yard signs are a huge issue. Any kind of signage, no matter how small or personal, is strictly prohibited. You can't even put up a simple sign that says welcome or home sweet home. In fact, one neighbor of mine got fined for a small flag with a heart on it that she hung on her front door for Valentine's Day. The HOA claimed that it violated their rule about external signage, and they even gave her a warning before issuing the fine. The weirdest part is that my neighbors and I had just moved in, and no one knew about this rule until someone tried to put up a Happy Holidays sign in their yard. It was a tiny, non-obtrusive sign that barely stood out, but the HOA still had an issue with it. They argued that it disturbed the uniformity of the neighborhood. And if you want to put up a small political sign during election season or show support for a cause, forget it. You'll be fined immediately. It's not just the obvious signs either. It's any sign, even the most basic and neutral. I understand not wanting to have a ton of advertising clutter, but this feels a bit extreme. There's something a little dystopian about a place where you can't express any kind of personal style or opinion. Story 30. If you want to have any kind of outdoor furniture, you better be prepared to follow the HOA's very specific guidelines. The rule is that all outdoor furniture must be neutral in color and style, and it cannot be anything that's too modern or out of place. This means no bold or vibrant colors, no contemporary designs, and certainly no fun, relaxing pieces like hammocks or lounge chairs. I found this out the hard way when I bought a set of outdoor furniture for my patio. I was excited to set up a cozy space where I could entertain guests or just enjoy the nice weather. But when I set up a colorful patio set, the HOA sent me a letter saying it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. The furniture was stylish, practical, and even quite tasteful, but apparently my purple and teal cushions were too loud. I was shocked by how much emphasis they put on this one small detail. The HOA then provided me with a list of approved furniture brands and styles, which were all boring, beige, and dull. The whole experience left me wondering if I was living in a place designed for robots, not people who want a bit of color and character in their lives. Now, I'm stuck with generic outdoor furniture that looks like something you'd find in an airport lounge. It's a real shame that the HOA's idea of community harmony is just a sea of blandness. Story 31. The most ridiculous HOA rule I've ever encountered is their obsession with uniform lawn length. They've decided that every single lawn in the neighborhood must be cut to exactly 2.5 inches. No more, no less. This rule is enforced with the precision of military order, and it's not just a suggestion, it's a requirement. If your grass is even a hair longer or shorter, you're subject to a fine. I once received a letter saying my lawn was 2.7 inches, and I needed to fix it within 48 hours or face a $50 fine. I measured my lawn with a tape measure just to make sure I wasn't going crazy, and sure enough, it was slightly off. I tried to explain to the HOA that a small variation in grass height is pretty much inevitable, especially when you're dealing with different kinds of grass and weather patterns. But they wouldn't hear it. They even mentioned that if I couldn't keep my lawn at the correct height, I could hire an approved landscaping service to handle it for me. So now, I spend my weekends constantly checking my lawn with a ruler, terrified that it might inch over that 2.5-inch limit and get me fined. It's such a pointless rule, but the HOA seems obsessed with making sure no one's lawn looks even the slightest bit different from anyone else's. Story 32. My HOA has a strict no signage rule, and I didn't realize how serious they were about it until I put up a small sign that said, "Lost Dog," when my pet went missing. The sign was just a simple, homemade sign that I attached to a telephone pole in front of my house. It wasn't large, it wasn't offensive, and it didn't distract from the neighborhood. But when the HOA found out about it, they sent me a letter claiming that this was a violation of their aesthetic uniformity policy. Apparently, even a small helpful sign can ruin the visual flow of the community. They told me to take the sign down immediately or I would be fined $100. I was dumbfounded. How can a small sign that's literally about lost pets be a violation of any kind? I explained my situation to the HOA and asked if they could make an exception just for this one sign, but they wouldn't budge. They said they understood my concern, but that the rules had to be followed. Eventually, my dog was found, and I removed the sign. But the fact that the HOA was more concerned about uniformity than someone's pet getting lost was beyond frustrating. It's a reminder that, according to my HOA, the aesthetics of the neighborhood are more important than helping people in need. Story 33. I've never encountered a more strange rule than my HOA's ban on front porch furniture. Apparently, you're not allowed to place any seating on your front porch unless it's a government-approved style. This rule is in place because they believe any outdoor furniture on the front porch creates a cluttered look. Now, I get it if the furniture was mismatched or tacky, but I wanted to put a couple of simple, comfortable chairs with a small table on my porch. Nothing too extravagant, just something nice for relaxing outside on a warm day. I thought it would be a nice way to enjoy the outdoors without bothering anyone. The HOA didn't agree. I got a notice saying that I had to remove the furniture because it didn't conform with the approved style of the community. When I asked what specific style I needed to follow, they gave me a vague list of rules, including furniture must be uniform in color and neutral in tone. I was told that the only acceptable furniture was a basic bench or a matching set of beige wicker chairs. Nothing too modern, nothing too casual. This rule seemed ridiculous to me. I wasn't trying to make my porch look like a party zone. I just wanted a place to sit outside without violating the HOA's idea of what's acceptable. After arguing with them, I had to remove my furniture and settle for a bland, uninviting porch. I think it's a shame that the HOA would rather dictate what kind of seating I'm allowed to have than let me enjoy my space in peace. Story 34. My HOA has an obsessive rule about flagpoles. It all started when my neighbor tried to install a flagpole in his front yard, just to display the American flag. Simple, right? Well, the HOA didn't think so. They sent him a letter saying that flagpoles were unapproved structures and that he needed to take it down or face a fine. The explanation they gave was that flagpoles disturb the visual symmetry of the neighborhood and that there were too many already. Keep in mind that my neighbor's flagpole was discreetly placed in the corner of his yard and wasn't in anyone's way. So, he removed it, only to have the HOA then send a letter to the next neighbor who tried to put up a flagpole in the exact same location. This time, it was because the flagpole distracted from the architectural aesthetics. It was absolutely absurd. The worst part was when my next-door neighbor, who had flown the flag for years, was suddenly told that her flagpole had to go because it didn't conform to the HOA's new guidelines. It felt like the HOA was just trying to police every little thing about the neighborhood. The whole thing made me wonder what they'd target next. What's next? No wind chimes because they disrupt the peace. The rules feel arbitrary, and all they do is make life more difficult for the residents who just want to enjoy their homes. Story 35. The HOA in my neighborhood has an unwritten rule about trees that drove me insane. According to them, you can't have any tree in your yard that's not a pre-approved species. Of course, they don't give you a list of those species up front, and you only find out once you've planted a tree that doesn't meet their approval. I found out the hard way when I planted a small cherry tree in my backyard because I thought it would look beautiful and provide some shade. It's not even a massive tree, just a small ornamental variety. But a few weeks later, I got a letter from the HOA saying that my tree was non-compliant because it wasn't one of their approved species. They gave me the option of removing it or paying a fine. When I asked why, they said that certain trees were better for the environment and fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. But that explanation didn't make any sense to me. I mean, what harm could a small cherry tree do? It wasn't even blocking anyone's view. After some back and forth, they finally allowed me to keep the tree, but only after I agreed to prune it into a specific shape. This rule is so specific and arbitrary. It feels like they just want to control what goes on your property, even when it's something as simple as planting a tree. Now, every time I want to plant something, I double-check with the HOA to avoid more fines. It's exhausting living under such restrictive rules. Story 36. My HOA has this strange obsession with patio furniture, but not just any kind. There are rules about which type of patio furniture is allowed. The guidelines state that all outdoor furniture must match the classic and timeless aesthetic, which translates to beige, white, or brown wood or metal furniture. The idea is to create a uniform and elegant look for the neighborhood, but the rule is so restrictive that it feels ridiculous. One time, I decided to add a bright red outdoor couch to my porch, just to make it a little more lively and fun. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA informing me that the color was too bold and distracted from the cohesive look of the street. They gave me 2 weeks to replace it with something more neutral or face a fine. I explained that I didn't see why my porch needed to look like a carbon copy of every other house, but they wouldn't budge. So I ended up finding a set that was a soft gray. Nothing too outrageous, but it still felt bland and uninspired. It's frustrating to think that I'm forced to strip away any personality from my own porch just to appease a group of people who have no business telling me what I can and can't enjoy on my property. Story 37. One of the weirdest rules in my neighborhood revolves around outdoor lighting. The HOA is very specific about what kinds of lights you're allowed to have, and their biggest issue is with decorative lights. For example, if you put up string lights or even small decorative lamps, they immediately send you a notice. Their explanation is that such lights create unnecessary glare and could disturb the uniformity of the neighborhood. I had a small set of twinkling lights in my front yard during the holiday season that I thought looked charming. But no, apparently, they were a violation. The HOA told me they were too flashy and ordered me to remove them, stating that any lighting that deviates from the standard issue outdoor lighting design is not allowed. I was floored. The lights weren't even visible from the street, and they didn't interfere with anyone's peace. It's not like I had some elaborate, distracting light display. It was just a few small lights that added a bit of character to my front porch. It made me realize just how much control they wanted to have over every tiny detail of our homes. Now, I feel like I can't even have a little festive cheer in my own yard without it being policed. Story 38. The HOA in my neighborhood has an absolutely ridiculous rule about bicycles. According to them, no bike can be left outside unless it's properly stored in a designated space. That sounds reasonable, right? But here's the kicker. They require that bikes be stored in either a shed or inside your garage. If you leave a bike on your porch or even lean it against your garage door for a few hours, you get a warning. One summer, I was out for a bike ride and simply leaned my bike against the front wall of the garage while I was doing a few things around the yard. The next thing I know, I get a letter from the HOA saying I violated their bicycle storage policy and that I had 48 hours to move the bike or face a fine. I honestly couldn't believe it. It was just sitting there for an afternoon. The explanation? They said that having bikes visible from the street gives off an unorganized and cluttered vibe, and they wanted the community to maintain a neat and pristine appearance. My neighbors thought it was silly too, and I started noticing that some of them had taken their bikes out to the driveway, only to quickly rush to get them inside before the HOA could catch them. We were all just trying to enjoy the outdoors, but now we had to hide everything just to comply.